Well, Sarah and everyone, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing today, Sarah?
Doing great. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining today's LinkedIn Live that we have going on. So today we're going to be talking about how to know when your B2B organization is ready for PR. Perhaps you may have a good marketing foundation, a great website, engaging email, awesome social media content, and perhaps you're considering PR as the next step to really help elevate your brand. But how do you know if you're really ready for that? So today we're going to be talking with our awesome PR partner, Sarah Lemmon from Lemmon PR. She's based in Seattle. And we're going to be talking about how to know when your company is ready for PR, the 4 essential items needed to have in place when building an effective PR story. And then lessons learned Sarah can share of working with B2B companies and nonprofits in Seattle on their PR strategy. So before we dive in, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop those into the comment box and we'll be monitoring those as we go along today. And I'll just introduce myself. I'm Emily Trickey, the co-founder of Brilliant Marketing. We are a marketing and branding agency in the Pacific Northwest, and we help nonprofits and B2B businesses get back to their big vision by taking their branding and content marketing off of their plate. And so I'm really excited to have our guest here today, Sarah Lemmon. She's our awesome PR partner that we've worked with on multiple clients together. So welcome, Sarah. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks. Yeah, so I own Lemmon PR. I started as a journalist, and kind of my whole purpose for having a PR company is to help small and medium-sized businesses to tell their story, to get out there, to get the attention that they deserve, to bring business their way.
That's awesome. So tell us a little bit about how you kind of started in PR. Like, what's your kind of story? How did you end up where you're at now, having your own PR agency?
Yeah, I mean, like all paths, there's many different ways to get here. But I started as a journalist years ago, worked for a newspaper, did some freelancing, and then worked for a magazine, and was working at a time when newspapers and magazines were downsizing. And I myself got downsized and needed to find a job. And I had talked to a few folks in PR, and I was realizing that the difference between a journalist and a PR person is very small. Basically, it's finding that story and what is relevant and trying to figure out how to make that into, for a PR person, how to make that into something that is good for your client. But for a reporter or, a media influencer, it's how to make sure that that is going to be applicable to your audience that you're writing about or podcasting about. So I love people. I love hearing their stories. I'm the kind of person that will just talk to you for 10 minutes at the grocery store. And so the fact that I get to do that and learn about people and what they do and feel like I'm actually making an impact and helping small to medium-sized businesses is the best thing ever. So that's how I made that transition. When I stopped being a journalist, I went to agencies and did that for several years. And then 8 years ago, I started my own company, Lemmon PR, and just really gravitated to the types of clients that I just get really passionate about, which tends to be, that small to medium-sized, family-owned company. I love food. I love farming. I love nonprofits. And those are a lot of the different types of clients that I've really gravitated to and that I've had the pleasure of working with.
That's really awesome. I love that you made the transition from journalist to PR and just the similarities there and that you were in the shoes of, now you're able to pitch people and understand what they want because you are a journalist and really understand what it takes.
Yeah. And I think, that's, one of the hardest parts about being in PR, and we've talked about this before, is the rejection of that, of, you're pitching a story. And part of my job is to work with clients and to tell them up front, this is or isn't relevant. And those are hard stories to tell. And so a big part of what I do is really trying to make sure that what are your stories? And sometimes it's more than one. And being upfront with a client of this is not maybe the best PR approach for you, but maybe this is a good advertising approach for you. And so, really trying to just get to the nugget of what makes that company different and tick, and then how that translates into a story.
Totally. That makes sense. And that kind of leads me to my first question, which is, how do you know when your company is ready for PR?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to just be I'm just going to keep on saying this the whole time is what is your story and how is it different from any other agents, any other company that you're working with that is out there, maybe your competitors? How are you doing something different? I often call it the headline test too. Can you condense down what you think the news of your company and what it's doing could be into a headline that you would want to read? And so that's often the first step. And if the answer is no, that doesn't mean you aren't relevant. Maybe we need to come up with like some programming ideas or like figure out some different strategies for you. But fine tuning what makes you different is the only way. And through that story, like making sure that you have a solid story. You have to think about media as like, the other side of the chair. And like you said, I've sat in that chair before. So like you pitch a story to a media member, they've got to pitch it to their editor. Or if you pitch it to a freelancer, they've got to pitch it to multiple different editors in order to get that story to come into fruition. And so it's not an easy sell. Like once you talk to that reporter, it's not done there. They've got to then sell it to people up the command. Right. So it's got to be really honed in.
Totally, for sure. So like what makes a good story? Like, it's relevant to the media.
It's something that's compelling. It's something, maybe it's human interest. It's something that you want to hear about. Not all stories are good news, but it's something that is different. It's not the same story that you're hearing all the time. I'll give you an example. I work with a lot of different, both B2B, nonprofit, and then I call it lifestyle. So I'm pitching, TV, radio, magazines, those kind of things. But, restaurant PR is really difficult because there's so many restaurants, especially here in Seattle. And I worked with this restaurant recently and they were an amazing pizza place. They were a cute neighborhood spot, but what made them different? So we had this kickoff meeting and I found out that this chef takes 10 days to make his pizza dough.
Wow.
That like from a cost perspective and a time perspective, like that takes a lot of time to do. But also like he was so lovingly doing this. And so we built our entire piece on that. And it was really interesting because if you look up his restaurant, the headline almost always is this restaurant takes 10 days to make their pizza dough. So, I mean, that's the headline test, right? That was something that worked. So, and by the way, that is the hardest thing, to try to consolidate everything that you feel is relevant into a very small, like less than a tweet, really,
Totally. Is that kind of like if someone's considering PR, potentially have them sit down and kind of brainstorm, like, what would you want your headline to be, your dream headline to be, and what makes you relevant, and how is that different than any other headlines that's out there today?
Yeah. I mean, so when I do a kickoff with new clients, we'll do this exercise I call headlines from the future. Mm-hmm. And so, there's different audiences, and there's, whether you're working with like a business journal or a newspaper or like a magazine, it's going to be different headlines. And so I have my clients sit and do like 3 different ones. So it could be like NPR, it could be like Seattle Times, and it could be, like the business journal of whatever, like a very specific one. And during that time, they have to come up with different headlines because your audience is going to be different. And it's a really interesting exercise because it's so hard off the cuff. It's almost impossible, honestly, off the cuff to come up with that. But as you start thinking in those terms, that's when you start realizing what is the most relevant, because you do have a minimum amount of real estate to get that across.
Totally. I love that segmentation of the different audiences. Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. So what kind of like foundational marketing things should companies have in place before they embark on doing PR?
That's such a good question. And like, honestly, I oftentimes will wait to do PR until those things are in place, because so much of PR is making sure that you're saying the same thing, between your spokespeople or on your website or on your Instagram or whatever your mechanisms are. And so, having your website up and with your current messaging is going to be super impactful and like necessary. If you have things that are outdated, we need to like go through and like fix all of those. But also like, oftentimes when you're pitching media, they want to know, why should I write this story now? And so having things that are relevant, whether it's blog posts with like current things that are applicable to what's happening in the news, or events that you're hosting, or maybe you've been in the news recently. And like, that's something that, the end game of PR is to get this publicity, but it doesn't stop there. Then you have to figure out those mechanisms of where you're going to publicize all of that. And so it's interesting because like, while that's where I stop as PR, I also feel like I've become this coach of like, okay, how are you pulling all the handles to make sure that you're broadcasting those to all those different mechanisms? So, I can evangelize about websites. Even though I don't do them, like I can do my own, but like website stuff in place is one of the first things. Having visuals is so important too. Not only if it's just like a great like picture of like a spokesperson maybe that's going to be featured, but the products that you want to use to like publicize those. Having visuals, photos, videos, having all of those in place is hugely important. So yeah, those are like 2 of the biggest things, just like marketing things right off the bat to have.
That's great. Yes. And we talk about that with our clients, is just that because the PR is going to be sending people either back back to the website or to social channels? Like, where are we going to be sending people once the story is out there, and making sure that virtual window of your business that you have is all consistent and beautiful and is telling the story that you want to be there.
Yep.
So that's great. So how do you know if like the time is right for, like, how would a company know if the time is right to embark on PR?
Yeah, I'd say if you have those other pieces put together, like, you know that the story is relevant. The time is like the next most important thing, because you need to think about it from many different perspectives. Like, part of this is kind of like the pre-planning of who is your audience. And if you're a business, your potential buyers might be, or partners, and there's many different ways to engage them. But making sure you know those audiences will help to impact on where we want to get the press. And so when you look at them, you need to be thinking about both short-term and long-term. And so like, if you're going to be making an announcement and it's not going to be happening for like 6 months, there needs to be a thought of like, okay, are we ahead of the game? We're way ahead of the game for short lead, but like long lead might need that information now. So thinking about like when you want to see the press is one of the biggest determining factors. That said, that's also the hardest part about PR, I feel like. And when I have clients that are like, hey, we have this announcement, we're ready for this next week. And it's like, okay, so let's back up for a second. Here's the reality of what we can do within that time scope. And, I always like provide examples of like competitors, and when that's happening, we look at editorial calendars of when magazines or newspapers are going to be publishing things. But the timing is so critical. And, the short answer to what you just asked is like, when do you want this press to come out?
Got it. And different publications have different lead times and what's doable, right? So say a company's like, okay, I got the story. I've kind of figured out like the timing. What are kind of the like 4 essential items that you need to have in place when you're building that like PR story?
Yeah. And I would say some of those things are the essential, like 2 of those things are definitely the essential things. So you start with the story, then you know your audience. Like after that, you need to know who you want and how you're going to get them. I would say then you need to get your spokesperson in place, and who that's going to be, if it's the owner, if maybe it's a charismatic higher up in your company, someone that's had these experiences that can really like showcase the best foot forward for your company. So having that person in place, and that would be, a spokesperson training and making sure that they're comfortable talking about that. Sometimes the person that we think is the spokesperson, it's just not their story to tell, and it doesn't come across as genuine as someone else. And so sometimes that step takes a little bit longer, and that's fine. It's different for every company. I already talked about visuals. Visuals are so important. Having those in place too. That's often what I pitch with. So, I often create like a fact sheet of a company just to give kind of a one-stop shop for media to know, here's the company, here's what they do, here's how they do it, and here's why it matters, to really make sure that everything is right there. So they're not having to go through all the website and all the social. They'll go there, but like we want them to get it right off the bat with a fact sheet. And so like having some visuals on that's going to be important. But I'd say the 4th one too is just like having the time and the budget for PR. So PR takes time. Sometimes it gets a long time. And I tell the story of, I had pitched a story one time. This happens all the time, but I had pitched, in this specific case, had pitched a story to a magazine. And it was like, the reporter had been non-responsive for like several weeks. And then all of a sudden is like, yes, I'd like to do this story. It will come out a year from today. I was like, okay, that was like the longest lead time. You know what I mean? And I may not be working with that client then, but I'm still watching to make sure when that comes out. Right. So like, it's a little bit, PR is a little bit like fishing. You got to pitch and see who's going to, bite on that.
Yeah.
But it's time. And like, that there's so many differences between advertising and PR. And one of the biggest ones is just, you got to be patient. You got to have the time, but you also, up front, you determine like, we need to get eyeballs, for example, on this new product we have before this trade show or whatever, And so working with someone to make sure that, okay, maybe we need to do some short lead. Maybe it needs to be online media. Maybe it needs to be this podcast. Those types of things really make a big impact. And, PR it's a lot cheaper than advertising. Back in the day when I first started this, we'd always compare, we got you like a half page coverage with color and, 600 words, and that would cost you $20,000. This campaign cost you $5,000, something like that. And it's really interesting to see. That doesn't work all the time, but I think it is, PR can be a much more effective way in some cases than advertising.
Right. That's really interesting. Well, thanks for those kind of like 4 tips. It's like story, the spokesperson, the visuals, the time, and the budget is really what people should think about. The target audience of like the audience of who's going to be reading it and where they're going to be. And so can you talk a little bit about like some of the examples of working with some of your PR clients and lessons learned here in Seattle?
Yeah, definitely. So I've worked in the Portland market and in the Seattle market. And there's similarities, but there are also some big differences. And, one of the big differences, should say, just backing up even more than just Seattle and Portland, is that, you compare some of these bigger cities, compare Seattle to New York, and it is so different. Seattle is, it's not a big market. It's growing all the time, but like media tends to adapt to that as well. So, until recently, we only had one morning TV lifestyle show.
Yeah.
We've got two, but like New York, there's, how many do you want? There's a ton of them. So, I'd say why that is applicable is because PR is so much about the relationships, and you can't, when you're telling your story, whether you're doing that in-house or working with a PR person, you have to make sure it's relevant, because that's when the emails will get read by media. If you continue to send pitches that are just a big net that are not applicable to, like, you're pitching the food trade journal, and it's like, this is a non-food trade journal story. You can't just it to everybody. And I mean, that's sometimes that's what happens in PR. You've got 400 contacts and you send that, So I think, you really have to hone in on the relationships and making sure that you make those, like, I don't send big net emails. Mine are one-on-one, because that's, I think, where you're going to get the best results. You make it applicable. Who's writing what and what they have written in the past. Example of that is an amazing client that we worked on together called Lifelong here in Seattle. And they are a nonprofit. They work in many different sectors, but they basically try to help people get access to healthcare, access to food, access to housing. And so the piece that we were looking at most closely was the access to food. And they had just developed this new culturally relevant meals program. And it was meals from 5 different regions of the world. And so the thought is that these are medically vulnerable individuals that are getting these meals either like pre-cooked, like prepared for them, or all of the grocery bags with the food that is from where they originated. And like understanding that food is medicine, but food is also love. So recognizing that, and like, these are the kind of stories that I love to tell, but I'm also so sensitive to the fact that we have vulnerable populations. I'm not going to go in there and do a press conference. I'm not going to go in there and promote. We have 50 people in these sensitive groups that are vulnerable. So what we did is Lifelong did this amazing launch where they asked all of these community partners to come in and taste test some of the new food. And so rather than inviting, 20 different reporters, I invited one that I felt like was the most impactful. And he writes stories about vulnerable communities, but also the intersection of food. And so we had him come in, experience both the good and the bad, where people were like, this is not the food I love, or this is the food that I love. And the chefs were listening and they were taking notes and they were tweaking it so that when people that received these boxes of food got those, it not only like helped their soul, but it, helped them medically. And so that took a long time to like make sure, from a logistics perspective, making sure that all the partners knew that we had one person that was coming that would be a reporter. It took time to make sure that the kitchen staff that was there was trained to know, like, this is what's going to be happening. And here's how to speak to that. But also we needed to find people that had experienced the food and were comfortable talking about that. And that took a lot of interviews of people to make sure that they felt comfortable and felt that they were put in a position where they were not stigmatized, So the result of that was front page of the Northwest section of the Seattle Times. And it was very cool because like immediately you could see people, it brought donors, it brought donations, it brought a lot of chatter within the agency of Lifelong too. One of the halo effects of PR is it can really be exciting for employees to see the work and the impact that they're doing in the news. So, it's interesting because, I've done the things where it's like, let's get you on like the Today Show, and like, that's really fun. But these types of, localized, specific targeting media where you can see the good work that Lifelong was doing and it get like bolstered up, like that honestly is one of those like amazing projects that was so fun to work on.
So that's so cool. It's so heartwarming to hear. And Lifelong just is such an awesome, like mission-based nonprofit doing great work in Seattle. And I guess it just also goes to show like how valuable it is to have a PR professional that knows the market, that knows the reporters, that has that personal relationship, that you knew the right person to go to that was going to really do the story justice. And it sounds like really, really worked.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So can you talk a little bit about like the different types of PR, kind of like traditional versus non-traditional? I heard you mention like podcasts a little bit, like shorter lead time stuff. So can you just talk a little bit about some of the different types?
Totally. Yeah. I think when people talk to me about PR, what they first say is like so do you do press releases? And I'm like, not if I can hit it. Like press releases they can be effective in some places, but they're not always where you need to go. So there are so many different channels, to your point about where to go. And so, I kind of look at it as short term and short lead and long lead. And the long lead tends to be the magazines, sometimes the newspapers. Sometimes they work on stories way in advance. Some of those ones that just are longer form. The short lead tend to be things like online publications, which can get confusing because Seattle Times has online and it has in print, right? Seattle Met, for example, also does that, but I think they're up to like 4 issues a year again, but they do a lot online. And so making sure that you're targeting, who and when for that can be really important. Podcasting is huge. And, so is trade journals. There's so many different mechanisms there, but I think, when you're thinking about PR, it doesn't have to be just those media mechanisms like that. You can also be thinking about like spokesperson opportunities for you to go and speak at a conference or speak at a TED Talk. Some of those different things can be just as effective, and with the right client too, it can be trying to figure out if maybe they need to get a column. Maybe they are an expert in their field. And, I worked with a client recently that we've both worked with, and getting him in a quarterly publication and him having kind of a stake at the table where every issue he has his own like seasonal story is very cool. Or getting him on TV once a season based on what he's in like the food and beverage, making sure that he's got, trends and stories to tell of what he anticipates are going to be the next biggest thing and how to do it. So, having both of those different things in place. TV, I think too, I didn't mention it, but TV and radio are still humongous. And TV is where, it's interesting because you look at the demographics and it tends to be an older demographic of folks that are watching that. But every time I get a client on TV, right afterwards, their sales go up. And so it's, it might be an older demographic, but they're also sending that to a younger demographic, their kids or their grandkids. And it's driving a lot of sales that way. So there's so many different channels and ways to go about PR.
That's really cool. Can you talk a little bit about podcasting? I know we were chatting a little bit about that. It's like, I know that can be like a low-hanging fruit for people, but can you talk a little bit about how do you do podcasting well to actually drive your goal?
Podcasting is such a good example of how you should analyze every single opportunity that comes your way with the media. And so the reason I say that is podcasting, anyone can have a podcast. Anyone can go on a podcast. It takes time to get all of your stuff together and prepped for a podcast. And sometimes it can take months for the podcast to come out. You want to make sure that, and I'm not trying to disparage podcasts. We've had some great success with podcasts, but making sure that you know the value of what that's going to be. And PR is one of those things where it's like every time I launch with a client, we always start with what are your goals and how will this help you with that? So, if you're on a podcast that has nothing to do with any of your core demographic, it may not be the best. Or if it doesn't have a lot of viewers or audience, that is not going to maybe drive the most for you. Maybe though, that is an opportunity for you to get your feet wet in doing an interview with a media member. And so that you can be more relaxed for some of the next ones too. So, but with podcasting, you need to make sure it's reaching your audience. You're getting the value out of it that you want, and you're reaching the most eyeballs that would be effective.
That's great. Yeah. So it's really kind of going back to what you were saying before too, of just like, where do you want to be, and making sure it's quality where your audience is going to be, the listeners there.
Yeah, definitely. And this is not PR, but like I always go and just Google a client's name, like what comes up.
Yeah.
And the news will bring up to the top. And I'm not an SEO expert, but I do know that like part of the reason you do PR is because you want to be known for these things. You want to be known for the guy that makes the best pizza because it takes 10 days to do that. And so having that in Google when people are looking for a restaurant close by, or looking for a supplier or whatever the businesses that you have, that will be really, really helpful. If you go on a podcast that doesn't have that many eyeballs, it's never going to show. And you've spent all the time doing the interview.
Totally. Oh yeah. Or in some of our cases, we've been on podcasts and then they've never been published. We're like, all right.
So frustrating. It's so frustrating. And that's also like why sometimes you hire a PR person is they're tracking all of that. And with the changing media landscape of freelancers, there's so many freelancers right now. As staff at magazines or radio or newspapers has gone down, they don't get notified that that story came out. And so you're tracking right along with them.
Yeah.
And so it takes a long time to track those, but each of those, making sure once you get those clips, you put them into like how are you going to amplify it after that? That's what so much of the value is.
Totally. Repurposing it and reusing it and getting it out there.
Yep.
Well, I know we're kind of wrapping up our time. I have one last question for you. So what are kind of like the steps in PR? So if someone said, I'm launching this new service or product, or I'm doing, X, Y, and Z, what would you say are kind of like the steps that they should think about for PR?
I mean, I think it goes back to how you're ready for PR. Like it goes back to that original story of like, okay, so you're about ready to launch this. How is your story different? How can we tell it? When do you want it to come out into the world? When is it going to be born, publicly to the world? And you can showcase all of that. And when would the most impact be for your company?
I love that. I think that's a really good just takeaway for people as they're considering PR as potentially a new, marketing strategy for their business to increase their brand awareness and reach their business goals. So I just want to thank you so much for the time that you shared with us and with our audience here today. So can you tell us how people can find out more about you, and if they're interested in PR? Are you taking new clients? Do you do a discovery call for people? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my website is Lemmon PR. It's lemon like the fruit, but with 2 M's, lemmonpr.com. And I always offer an hour discovery call with folks. And during that time, I will be extremely candid with you if I think you might want to spend your media or your money in social media or advertising. It's, I always say that PR is really a two-way street. And the only way that reporters are going to open up my email from them is if I'm providing relevant clients to them. And, fit is such a big thing too. And so if I don't have the Rolodex or if I don't have the background in that, I'm very vocal about that. That said, I do have a wide network of folks that may have a different Rolodex, or a different skill set. But I mean, at the end of the day, I do this because I absolutely love doing it and because I want to get good results for clients. So anytime anybody would like to talk about, hey, is PR the right thing for me? I'm happy to chat. My email is sarah@lemmonpr.com, or you can go on my website, lemmonpr.com too.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Well, those listening or watching this, feel free to reach out to Sarah. And if you have any questions around marketing, your content marketing, your branding, we are available as well at hellobrilliantmarketing.com. So thank you so much for your time, Sarah. We really appreciate it. We love working with you, and hopefully we can work together on some more clients in the future.
I'm already looking forward to it. That'd be great.
Yay. Awesome. Well, have a great day, Sarah. And thank you all for joining in. We'll see you next time.
Bye.